Let's start with the bad and slowly work our way towards the stuff you would never dream of. Stocks. We start at the lighter end of Tudor punishment, where the aim is less about injury and more about turning your mistake into public entertainment, before things slowly begin to get harsher. A wooden frame locked a person's ankles, and sometimes hands, in place in a public area. It was mainly used for minor offenses like disorderly behavior. The idea was simple. Stand still, look uncomfortable, and let the entire village decide what they think of you in real time. In practice, it often turned into a noisy public event where boredom and embarrassment did most of the damage. Pillory. As things begin to step up slightly, the pillory takes that same public shame and turns it into something unavoidable. A wooden device locked the head and hands, forcing the person to stand upright in a busy town square. It was used for crimes like fraud or insulting behavior. Unlike quieter punishments, this one made sure you were the center of attention whether you wanted it or not. The crowd often took full advantage of the situation, meaning the punishment quickly became less about the device and more about the public reaction around it. Fines. Still on the milder side of Tudor justice, fines punished you in a way that hit differently depending on your wealth. Money was taken based on the crime and the person's status. For richer individuals, it was an inconvenience that slightly ruined their day. For poorer people, it could feel far more serious, turning small mistakes into long-term financial stress. It was one of the simplest forms of punishment, but also one of the most uneven in how it was experienced: imprisonment. Now we move into conditions that do most of the punishment themselves. Tudor prisons were not designed for comfort, order, or anything close to modern expectations. They were often overcrowded, dark, and poorly maintained. Food was limited, cleanliness was almost non-existent, and time inside could feel slow in a way that made every day heavier than the last. In many cases, the punishment wasn't just the sentence, but the environment itself wearing people down. Whipping. At this stage, punishment becomes much more direct. Whipping involved repeated strikes meant to cause pain and leave visible marks. It was often carried out in public, which added pressure beyond the physical punishment itself. The goal was simple: make the consequences obvious to anyone watching. It was commonly used for theft and repeated offenses, where authorities wanted both correction and a clear warning to others. Ducking stool. Things now shift into punishments that mix discomfort with public spectacle. The ducking stool strapped a person into a chair and repeatedly lowered them into water. It was usually used for people accused of being disruptive or causing trouble in their community. The experience combined shock, embarrassment, and unpredictability, especially as crowds gathered to watch each dip into the water. It blurred the line between punishment and public event in a way that Tudor justice often did. Branding. From here, punishment becomes permanent. Branding used a heated iron pressed into the skin to leave a lasting mark identifying a crime. It was often used for repeat offenders, making sure their past stayed visible wherever they went. Unlike earlier punishments, there was no temporary effect or recovery from it. Once it was done, it became part of a person's identity in the eyes of everyone else, which in some ways made it even more serious than the moment of pain itself. Hanging. Now we reach execution, where punishment becomes final. Hanging was one of the most common methods for serious crimes and was usually carried out in public. It served both as a sentence and as a warning, delivered in a way that required no explanation. The public setting was just as important as the punishment itself, reinforcing the consequences of breaking the law. Beheading. Reserved more for higher status prisoners, especially those accused of treason, beheading was considered a more controlled form of execution. It carried a sense of formality compared to other methods, reflecting the status of the person being punished. Even so, it remained a serious and irreversible punishment, used for some of the most severe offenses of the time. Burning at the stake. Used mainly for religious offenses, this punishment was carried out publicly as a warning about strict religious control. It was one of the most feared methods in the Tudor period, not because it was complex, but because it was intended to send a very clear and unforgettable message. The rack. Now we move into interrogation methods where the goal shifts from punishment to pressure, and silence becomes the main thing being tested. The rack slowly stretched the body using controlled force on the limbs, creating extreme strain that built over time. It wasn't always used as a final sentence, but as a way to force information out when words refused to come freely. In that sense, it was less about immediate punishment and more about breaking resistance until answers started to feel unavoidable. Gibbeting. Even after death, punishment in Tudor times could continue in a way that kept a person on display long after the trial was over. Gibbeting involved placing the body inside a metal cage and leaving it in a public space. It was meant as a warning that stayed visible for a long time, sometimes even years. Over time, people would pass it so often it stopped feeling like an event and started becoming part of the landscape, which in itself made the message even more constant. Drawing and quartering. At the absolute extreme end of Tudor punishment, reserved for treason, this method was designed to completely dismantle both life and identity. It combined execution with dismemberment, carried out in stages as a statement against betraying the crown. The process was not just about ending a life, but about making the punishment so severe and public that it became a warning no one could misinterpret. It represented the final boundary of Tudor law, where punishment was no longer about correction, but total removal. And that brings Tudor punishment to its harshest extremes, where simple mistakes could turn into public humiliation, and serious crimes could lead to consequences that went far beyond anything we would recognize today. From minor village punishments all the way to methods reserved for treason, it was a system built to be seen, remembered, and feared long after it was over.